This is costing women's lives. In health and healthcare, women are not being served and treated in the same way as men are. At puberty, you learn about like your period, but you don't learn about the entire other part of the menstrual cycle. Across the menstrual cycle, we also have different nutrient requirements. So much happens when we're asleep. It's not something you can like kind of skip out on. We can tie it to basically every health outcome. It's when we release most of our growth hormones and anabolic hormone. So it's the biggest low-hanging fruit that we can have for our health. We do have different nutritional requirements to men, and that is vitamins and minerals. Around pregnancy, we need folic acid. Through the menopause, we need vitamin D and calcium.
It's one of those issues that like I cannot believe isn't talked about more.
How are we getting away with this?
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to be here. We, for context, everyone, we actually recorded an episode on Hazel's podcast a few months ago, months ago.
No, it was weeks. It's quite recently.
I have no concept of time.
Lots of short-term memory there.
Literally. I get told off a lot for saying like the other day, because I'm always like the other day and it will be like 7 months ago. So I want to get straight into your kind of background and giving some context on your expertise and your job and everything like that, so that people can understand what we're going to talk about in this episode and how it kind of affects them, why they should know about it. So let's get back to way back when, early life, your beginnings. Could you give like a whistle-stop tour of essentially how you got to where you are now, career-wise, who you are, etc., etc.?
For sure. I will give you the elevator 60-second pitch if I can.
Perfect.
So way back when I was 14, I lost my father to a stroke. And that was the reason I decided I wanted to study medicine and become a doctor.
Yeah.
I didn't get the results I needed to study in Dublin. If people haven't picked up from the accent, I'm Irish. So I went to Wales, did a undergrad in biomedical sciences or medical sciences in South Wales for 3 years, then went into graduate entry medicine for another 4 years.
Oh, that's so interesting. You hear there are obviously multiple different routes into medicine.
Yeah.
Obviously, the more traditional one is studying medicine at university. Is that right? Do most people do that?
Yeah.
I love that. I love the fact that you kind of saw it as something you wanted to do and took a different route to go there. Was there anything during that point that made you think, oh, maybe I won't do medicine? Or were you pretty set on
I
that?
was pretty dead set. And the course that I joined was like fast track into Cardiff University Med School.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would select the top, I can't remember, 10, I think, for interview anyway.
Okay.
And so I just worked my ass off for that degree. I actually came top of my year and then went into med school, but slightly older at this point, like, which I think benefited me because I got out all the uni kind of party lifestyle in the first degree, and then I was really serious for med school. And then I qualified in 2016, moved to London, which was my first choice, and started working in a busy London hospital here. And throughout this time, whilst I was at med school, I started the Food Medic, which is my brand. And that also, I guess, stems from my interest in how our lifestyles impact our health, which is related to how my dad passed away because he died from stroke, which is like largely preventable in terms of the risk factors. And we talked about this at med school, but it was just like paying lip service, really.
Yeah, I've heard there's like because I remember kind of when I was originally starting in the fitness industry, my general interest in fitness, how I don't know if it was from you or if it was general kind of, because I remember, I followed you for a long time, and I remember there's something about the fact that like as a doctor, you're essentially, people can come to you about, it might be a kind of dietitian type thing, but actually in med school you get kind of like one lecture on nutrition, which seems insane.
Yeah, that's it. Like I can tell you how the gut functions, but in terms of like learning how to apply nutritional knowledge is like not something that doctors are trained to do. So I actually did return and do a master's in nutrition, in clinical nutrition at UCL, and then worked as a nutrition doctor for a while. So I'm like dual qualified as a nutritionist.
Amazing.
Then the pandemic hit, and I started writing The Female Factor, which is my third book. My first two were largely nutrition and recipe books. And The Female Factor was like a completely different book with the same publishers. So I had to really like convince them to trust me, not to do another like healthy blogger sitting on the counter holding a salad type of book. But like
which I can imagine is a lot more commercial in a way. Like I mean this is totally up my street. Like The Female Factor is like exactly the type of stuff I want to be reading about. But what I know, especially when it comes to, I mean, when I originally had conversations about my book, having moved out the fitness industry and having no fitness I don't have any fitness qualifications. I've always hired people with fitness qualifications in order to be able to, you know, be in the positions in the companies that for example, at Shreddy. So, you know, obviously everything's kind of qualified in terms of the advice. But I remember the amount of publishers that I essentially had to rule out because they would be like, and where's the fitness part of the book? Yeah. And I was like, oh, you literally, like, as in, I've talked about fitness online as someone engaging in fitness and someone who owns a company within the fitness space. I'm not going to be writing like a 28-day, you know, this to this for this kind of published book. It's like, that's very different from like the direction I want to go to. But I know that within the health and fitness space, they want to have a kind of like 14 days to a happy gut or whatever, which is very like valuable in its own right. But I can imagine once you've done two of those and you're kind of being like, actually my background is more like the, you know, this kind of research-based stuff that I want to be able to talk about. I can imagine that took a bit of persuasion.
It took a bit of persuasion, and there's nothing wrong with the other books. Like I really enjoyed writing them, but like this felt like a really significant piece of work that I needed to do. And when I said I would write the book, I didn't actually know what it would look like. I was only like stepping into the space of research, but I was noticing as like a woman, but also as a doctor to many women, that like in health and healthcare, women are not being served and treated in the same way as men are. And then they're not having the same outcomes, and they're living longer, but with poor health. And so I really wanted to understand why this was, and I was noticing like little biases in how we treat male and female patients in the hospital as well. So I like stepped into the research and just opened this minefield of how much disparity there is in healthcare.
Isn't
with
it
the sexes?
Something like there's until like the 1990s or something, you didn't have to have women in clinical trials or something.
Yeah, it was most of the medical research we have is based on a male body and just extrapolated to a female with the assumption.
Which is wild. Like, as in, like, how could, even just, like, knowing about, like, probably, like, one main difference between the sexes in terms of, like, carrying children and, like, the menstrual cycle and stuff like that. Like, how... an entirely different hormonal profile. Like, how are we expecting to be like, this is an entire study we did on like all men and maybe like one woman, and like you'd never be able to do that with like sample size, extracting it from like one person to a million people. So why would you do it from like literally missing out half of the population?
Well, this is it. And this is why it's so ironic, because they historically excluded women for three main reasons. The first is because of our fluctuating hormones, and that's like a nuisance for them to control
in terms of
so
variables,
we'll just pretend they don't exist.
Yeah.
The second is the risk of pregnancy. So there's like an ethical issues. And the third is the fact that women have historically been primary caregivers. So they just can't like come to the trials. But researchers haven't made it like accessible that they would do evening trials or like
the fact that, okay, sure, women are still very much
primary
caregivers, but the thought that like we expect women to be able to go to work, but we couldn't possibly do to be able to attend a doctor's appointment or to be able to like do anything, but we couldn't possibly do like a clinical trial to actually determine like what this species is in terms of like how it is. Like it's like laughable. It is insane. And like, it's one of those issues that like, I cannot believe isn't talked about more. I remember hearing like some of the stats on it a few months ago, and this is why I so wanted to do this episode, because I was kind of just like, in my mind, someone completely like separate to the field, absolutely no like knowledge in anything that you kind of specialize in. It's like there almost surely should be like a body put together to be like, how can we rework all of these main clinical trials that are like the backings of everything we know about medical conditions, and redo them, essentially, like including a 50-50 female to male split. Like, to me, that would make sense in terms of being like, I'd assume people in the field as well would be like, let's get more accurate.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's kind of just like even edging more towards that way, rather than there being like a task force put together to literally be like, let's redo these main things, like aware it's going to be quite expensive, but you know, we've managed to pull task force together for all of these different things as well. Like, to me, that's insane.
Yeah. And it's definitely, you know, now you do have to include sex disaggregated data, but it's happening so slowly. And by the time research happens that changes clinical practice, takes years. And in the UK, they released the Women's Health Strategy last year, which is basically outlining all the changes that they're going to do in terms of restructuring of the NHS and research.
Okay.
And that's a really positive step, but it is just paper at the moment. So everyone's always like asking me to go on the radio and talk about it. And I'm like, until I see any movements in this, I'm not willing to talk about it. Because we bring out papers all the time and change nothing.
Yes. No, I mean, I think it's absolutely crazy. I want to go on to talk about, first of all, the kind of talking a little bit more about women as small men and all of that, kind of like what that really means to someone from who might not have heard of that kind of at all as a concept. But before I want to do that, I want to get really clear on the differentiation between sex and gender so that we're referring correctly in this episode to that differentiation. Obviously, we're talking about kind of physiological sex, and your book is The Female Factor, and it's talking about the discrepancies in that way. Obviously, that doesn't affect gender and the kind of differentiation between like how you might identify. Could you talk a little bit to that, just so that people can, I guess I want to get really clear so that anyone can feel comfortable listening to this episode however they might identify, but still be able to take actions, you know, what might be for their health. But I understand that's obviously quite you know, it's a differentiation we want to get right when talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is tricky because a lot of the research does use sex and gender interchangeably and incorrectly.
Right.
And I found that like quite shocking when going through like research that actually specifically looks at differences between the sexes, but then they'll use gender terms.
The word gender, sure.
So when we talk about sex, we talk about what's assigned at birth, so male, female. And then gender is like how you identify, so it does not have to be the same as sex. The thing is, when it comes to research, and I'm like clear in the book, because it's not being so clearly separated, when I refer to woman, I'm referring to someone who's been assigned female at birth and identifies as a woman. Because whilst we have like very little research on actual female people, we have very much less research into trans people. And so it is not perfect. And I really like recognize that when talking, because I don't want anyone to feel like they're being excluded. So hopefully that makes it.
Of course, I think that's incredibly important, and I think it's not always going to be got right, especially coming from a perspective of both as people who identify as the sex that we were identify gender-wise as the sex that we were assigned at birth. So there are going to be nuances that we probably like don't quite understand, but I also think that like the alternative to that is steering clear of it completely in order not to. I think when you're approaching it in a way of being like, this is how I'm talking about it, there are some conflations in the research of the two terms, which makes it really hard to kind of differentiate what is like actual findings versus what they're conflating, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's incredibly important as well not to kind of just be like, I'm going to steer clear of this completely because I don't want to, you know, whereas actually realistically the sooner we're able to talk about this in a way that's kind of really open, we're able to move also more towards recognizing differences where it might come to, you know, non-binary identifications or whatever that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I use the term female in the title of the book. Of course. To make it really clear. But whilst we're on the topic, both sex and gender influence our health and our health outcomes. And I do talk about that in the book because as we'll like go into in the episode, it's not just our biology, it's also like these biases we have about women.
Sure.
And like that acts as a barrier to our access to healthcare.
Okay, that's incredibly interesting. Let's dive into the concept of why should women care about looking at their health in a different way than they maybe have been taught throughout their life, or the way they've maybe kind of perceived their healthcare service. Like what led to you writing this book in terms of the way that people should kind of care about that?
Well, if we think about the term women's health, it just means reproductive and gynecological health.
Right, sure.
When actually like our total body health matters. And we have historically been reduced to just that, just like our ability to conceive. And that is our main difference. When really, compared to male, a female and a male body is different on every cellular level because of these hormones, and because of our life experiences as well. But because we've excluded women from research historically, and we've just assumed that we are smaller men, it means that women are assumed to present the same way when it comes to certain conditions, respond to the same treatment and have the same outcomes, when in matter of fact, that's not correct. So if I use heart disease for an example, like typically if people think of any adverts they've seen, it will be a white older man clutching his chest. That is like classic heart attack picture. When women are just as likely to die from heart disease, and in fact, twice as many women die of heart disease in the UK than they do breast cancer, but there's less awareness around it.
Okay.
And women are also 1.5 times more likely to be misdiagnosed when having a heart attack compared to a man. And so from onset of symptoms to discharge from hospital, at every stage of that process, if you look into the research, women aren't being served. So, for example, when they first experience symptoms, women will typically, while chest pain is the most obvious symptom and both sexes experience that most commonly, women may also experience nausea, shortness of breath, symptoms that in the research we say atypical, but it's just because it's different.
Sure.
Women are also more likely to put off going to hospital and try self-medicate and put others first. So there's a delay. And when they get to hospital, then if they're not presenting with a classic picture, then they're less likely to be correctly diagnosed. And when it comes to heart disease, we say time is muscle because you want to get the heart perfused as quickly as possible.
Right.
So all these little delays lead to really devastating effects. Even when it comes to diagnostic tests, like we do blood tests and they measure enzyme levels, they're based on a man's heart, which is bigger. And so the kind of cutoffs may be too high. And this is something that like we know now, the British Heart Foundation have done research on it. We know that women's levels are slightly lower, and yet it's not yet been integrated into our clinical guidance. So we're still using universal cutoffs. And then when it comes to discharge, again, women are less likely to be recruited into rehab, which is really important to prevent a second heart attack.
How come?
It's mixed up in because they're not willing to attend it. It's not being presented to them. So it's kind of tied up in multiple reasons. The fact of the matter is, the fact that we know this, we should be driving more awareness in women.
Yeah,
we should have a stronger follow-up for them. And so if you add all these pieces to the puzzle, like a Swiss cheese model, it means that women are just falling through the gaps. And so they're more likely to die after a heart attack than a man would.
That's all like, to me, that poses, I mean, I'm not the first person to say this. I mean, like, to me, this poses a moral issue. But like, I feel like hearing all of that so black and white and so kind of straightforward, and so even the fact that like the blood test, what you would look at against, you know, what might be healthy and not healthy, or what might be presenting in a way or not presenting in a way. The fact that we don't have the results for what a woman's equivalent would be other than extrapolating from men's is like insane. Like that is absolutely unbelievable. Is that not a huge priority to overturn just for the, like, purely, not even from a moral standpoint, but from the standpoint of like getting more accurate science and treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. Like this is costing women's lives. And I've been kind of following this research ever since writing the book, and also work closely with the British Heart Foundation as their ambassador. And they do lots of research into women's health and released a report like Biology and Bias and how women are underserved in cardiology care. But this isn't just cardiology. It's like all of the different disciplines in medicine that we're like not treating women the same. Like even when it comes down to pain management, women are less likely to be prescribed painkillers, will get them later, are more likely to be given antidepressants for their pain. And it's just like shocking.
Yeah.
And like to read it as a woman, it makes me feel like so much anger. And to think, like, it makes me think back on like treating patients. Do I hold these biases? Like, how are we getting away with this?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is absolutely like kind of unbelievable. And I want to talk about what women can do in order to be able to, I mean, it's not, the onus absolutely shouldn't be on women, but like say in this specific case of heart disease, for example, what can women do to kind of advocate for themselves in order to be able to, or kind of, we'll get on to the kind of preventative stuff in terms of like actual lifestyle and the, you know, what you spend a lot of kind of time talking about. But like how hearing this, it's obviously kind of terrifying. And then you want to be able to go to the doctor and you want to be able to be believed. And then, but you also don't want to be a kind of hypochondriac, or you don't want to be wasting people's time, especially kind of in the UK when it's, you know, you're kind of costing the NHS, et cetera, et cetera. What can people do in order to be able to improve their chances of, you know, being correctly diagnosed, etc.?
I would say, like, first of all, don't feel like you are being a burden, because that's something that women often feel like they are. The fact that women are more likely to be given a psychiatric diagnosis than a physical one for a physical problem compared to a man just really illustrates how we often see women as hysterical. So like there's like research around a condition which causes a very high heart rate. And lots of women are misdiagnosed with anxiety when they present with it. Because they'll say, like, I've got flutters in my chest. And then the doctor will be like, oh, it's just anxiety. Like, you're just an anxious woman. So don't dismiss your feelings. I hope no one goes away from this podcast after having like a coffee and thinking, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack.
Right.
But if you are having like severe chest pain that isn't going away after resting, that is, you know, reason to call an ambulance. But if you are experiencing any health condition, regardless of whether it's like, you know, related to your heart or any part of your body, never feel like you're a burden. Advocate for yourself. If you feel like your GP isn't listening to you, you're very much in your right to ask to speak to someone else. You can bring someone with you. You can take notes. Like, I think the most powerful thing for me when I've seen patients who've felt like they haven't been listened to is when they come in and they've had a diary of symptoms and they're like, look, this isn't in my head. I've been experiencing this for 3 months. And yeah, people might say they shouldn't have to do all of that research. I should just believe them straight out. But sometimes it's like really powerful for you to like bring the facts. And also it makes you feel a bit more like confident in what you're saying. Yeah. Because the patterns are on the paper.
Yeah, no, for sure. Let's talk about vitamins, minerals, nutrition. Are certain vitamin and mineral requirements particularly important at certain points of women's lives?
Yeah. So the book, one of the chapters is nutrition. Obviously, it's my main thing. But I found it the hardest chapter to write because when it comes to food and nutrition between the sexes, like the biggest point of difference you'll come across is that women need less calories than men. And like it's all wrapped up in like, you know, this whole narrative that we should eat less, be smaller. Like even when it comes to like fitness classes, it's always, you know, tone and sculpt and be smaller versions of ourselves. But really nutrition, we do have different nutritional requirements to men, not just calorie requirements. And that is vitamins and minerals. And it will change across a woman's lifestyle cycle. So for example, the obvious one, like, you know, our iron requirements increase after we go through puberty. Around pregnancy, we need folic acid. Through the menopause, we need vitamin D and calcium. Across the menstrual cycle, we also have different nutrient requirements.
Right, yes.
Which I find the most interesting because like, for example, in the second phase of the cycle, which is the luteal phase after ovulation, just before the next period, progesterone and estrogen is quite high. And we burn up to 300 calories extra per day. So our metabolism's higher because our body is doing all this extra work. We break down more protein during that time. We also use other specific nutrients in excess. And what we find is that women typically will have like a response that you can really correlate to that increase in progesterone, which will be increased cravings for food, increased food intake. And I don't know about you, but a lot of women come to me and they're always like, I can't deal with those cravings around my period. And I find it's really helpful to explain that to women. Yeah. This is what's happening. It's not all in your head. You're not going crazy. And actually, there's just like, you can make some smart nutritional fixes around this time to help control those cravings, like adding in more kind of high fiber, complex carbs, increase your protein, healthy fats. And yeah, if you crave chocolate, it's fine to have chocolate. It's not going to do anything harmful to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so interesting. And the most interesting part, I think, is that like, we're like, when you spit, no, not what I meant at all. When you split people up at school in terms of like having the kind of PSHE classes and talking about, talking about sex, talking about a kind of periods, like all of these things, it's like, it is that whole kind of cliche that like the male students like learn about like sex, but not really anything other than like use a condom. Yeah. And like we're being taught kind of like you're gonna have a period and also like never have sex, and like nothing about kind of like consent or any of these important things, like nothing about like the fact that like I would consider myself quite like a curious person who like I read a lot, I listen to a lot of things, I spend a lot of time consuming information because I'm find things very interesting. The fact that I kind of didn't hear about the fact that I might be training differently or consuming differently or feeling different because of these specific things that aren't just like, oh, women get really weak and moody around their periods. Like, imagine changing your entire hormonal profile for like a period of time. Like, of course it's going to change the way that you're like, even you saying like you're burning 300 calories extra, like that's probably the only thing that like someone will hear and be able to kind of like justify like then cravings, rather than just being like, we know when we're pregnant, for example, that there's going to be a difference in terms of the amount you might need to eat. Sure, it might not be double, but it's going to be like, there's going to be a significant difference. The fact that it's like pretty much nowhere in like normal, you'd have to go really out of your way to find out these things, to me is just insane.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. And I think, like you quite rightly said, at puberty, you learn about like your period, but you don't learn about the entire other part of the menstrual cycle. The period is typically the first 5 days of an average 28 to 29 day cycle. Yes. But there's so much else that happens during those weeks.
Yeah, and you're always in the cycle at some point.
You're always in it. And so if we were teaching people from an early age, like this is what's happening in the different phases. You might feel like this, you might feel great here, you might feel stronger here. At this point of the cycle, you might want to have some more magnesium. Like telling people how to do this would help them have a much better experience of the menstrual cycle and like, dare I say, even enjoy it. But we're just told it's terrible and like it's just a period. Yeah, and crazy. Everything else is a roller coaster that you just have to ride.
That whole point about like the concentration being like the days where you're bleeding, and it's actually like, that's like this like such a small part of the pie if you're looking at like the actual way that we're kind of operating throughout an entire month or however your cycle might fall. Like, is just. I mean, it's ridiculous that we're literally taught like you're gonna bleed and you're gonna need a tampon, and then they're like, bye, like good luck, like have fun for the rest of your life.
And like we also normalize how painful it should be, which is why like I think like a lot of women put off going to their GP with like really heavy, really painful periods because they're like, oh, it's normal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think we briefly talked about this, but I know, I've been on birth control since I was like 13 because of having like such painful periods, to the point that like, I would not be able to see because I'd have such bad aura from migraines. My sister gets it too. She'll be like vomiting on the bathroom floor and like lying on the cold tiles for like her entire period. And like kind of just being like, we'll stick you on this pill, or like we'll stick, like I was even put on a combined pill when my family literally has thrombosis, and it was kind of just like, little girl in pain, like give her this pill in order to be able to like essentially change my hormonal profile completely, when like actually, if more questions were asked, it would have been seen that I'm literally the worst candidate for you to be like even giving that kind of at all. I just think that, I mean, the normalization of that kind of type of pain, and then it's seen as such like a trivial topic. Like if you look at comments on anything where it's like, oh, in Spain, or I don't know where it was, like the other day, saying that, or maybe Scotland, Wales, I don't know, saying
menstrual leave.
Yeah, menstrual leave, and then it's kind of like the trivialization of that, because it like kind of wipes out the concentration from like, I mean, I don't think that's trivial, but I think like it only takes you to look at some like Facebook comments on that and be like, oh, boo-hoo, and like all of this. And it's like, also we could get like great treatment on like PCOS and endometriosis that would actually like help women know if they have like a serious condition that means that they're actually going to find it pretty hard to function for a lot of their life.
That's it.
I remember watching this, like, I can't remember what it was. It was a documentary that I watched a few months ago. And it was women with endometriosis.
Was it Below the Belt?
Yeah, yes. I think it was. And it was like trying alternative treatments.
Yeah.
And I remember just like one of the women being like, oh yeah, I'd like strongly considered suicide multiple times because of it. Like, and doctors being like, periods are painful. Well, and it's like,
this is the thing.
To the point that someone's experiencing pain that they believe that it might be better for them not to live in order to be able to like, and you're telling them it's normal physiological pain because women bleed. Like, we're not in the Tudor times. Like, don't need to be like actually on the like verge of like not being able to like live anymore or actually like passing out from pain in order to be able to be taken seriously.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think like in my gynae rotation when I was a med student, one of the clinics I was assigned to was an endometriosis clinic, and it was the most profound experience. Really? Because I've never seen women so distraught, and like it was a male consultant and he was fantastic. Like he made me want to be like go into obs and gynae, because he was just like, whatever you do not dismiss a woman in pain. Like these women did not just have really heavy, painful periods. They were unable to have sex because it was so painful. Even going to the bathroom was extremely painful. They were having difficulty conceiving. Like it's not just heavy periods. It's like quite like a full body syndrome. And it takes on average 8 years to be diagnosed.
8 years. And like looking at the fact that, you know, young teenagers will be getting their periods at kind of like, I mean, I think I was like 11 or something, and then just going like your first experience of like actual severe pain and like going to a doctor and then being like, oh, welcome to womanhood. Yeah. And you're like, oh no, I'm literally like vomiting on the bathroom floor. Like this doesn't seem like something that should be normal. But the fact that like even like endometriosis, for example, like that 8-year diagnosis time is shocking. But then on top of that, like the fact that you can only really properly diagnose it through opening up someone's body, like you cannot tell me that if that was a male condition, we wouldn't have like significant improvements in research in order to be able to diagnose that, like outside of literally cutting someone open.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just shocking, and I think we could talk about it for years. Yeah. In terms of like actionable advice for vitamins and minerals and what people should be kind of prioritizing, is there anything that you would kind of be like, I know it's obviously very specific to the person, but I know you said, for example, like increasing iron intake, like after going through puberty, like increasing protein intake in your luteal phase. Are there any kind of real tips that you'd give in terms of like the types of vitamins that women should be making sure they're getting when there's so much kind of conflicting advice?
Yeah, it completely depends on where you're at in your lifespan, like premenopausal, pregnant, postmenopausal. But in general, like when it comes to, we'll just kind of assume the menstrual cycle, we'll use that kind of as our reference point. If you are menstruating, like iron's really important, obviously, especially like in that bleeding phase, but also menstruation in itself is an inflammatory process. Like it's just a huge amount of inflammation, which is why we experience cramps. And so like having like quite like a colorful anti-inflammatory diet can help support, reduce that like that feeling of cramps. Also there's like a slight dip in your immunity during your period. So like a lower white cell count. So adding in like vitamin C and those kind of antioxidants, which can help protect our immune system. Also, a lot of women, don't know if you experience this, report gut symptoms just before their period and during their period. So it's typically you'll get like looser stools just before your period, and then, constipation just before your period, and then looser stools during your period. And that's because of the big drop off of progesterone. So you may want to steer clear of like fried and fatty foods, caffeine, sugar-free foods, those foods that can like really stimulate your gut and make things worse.
Oh, interesting. So the thought of me staying away from fried and fatty foods during my period is like ambitious to say the least. But I Yeah, that's so interesting. I can so see why. I remember once seeing this like animation of how if your body's like, when your uterus, I think, is inflamed, and like the way it like shifts the other organs around it, kind of like when you're pregnant, but like if it's obviously like swelling because of your period. And I remember like seeing this animation and like it showing kind of how like it can also say like hit against something, which will mean that you'll get worse cramps or whatever it might be. And I remember being like, oh my God, I've never actually like thought of the fact, because I get really bad like it wouldn't be bloating, it would be like inflammation around my period, but it literally looks like I'm about like 5-6 months pregnant, and like it's like quite hilarious because it literally looks like the perfect shape for as if I was actually having a baby. I've had multiple times where I've been like, oh my God, if someone sees me right now, I'm actually there's going to be like rumors leaked. But yeah, and like then when you think about it, you're like, of course, like if that's going to change size and you're thinking of a circumference that's not actually like that big, then something else is like got to give, and it's likely going to be squished.
Well, that's it. So yeah, you can help yourself in that way. Obviously like iron rich foods are really important then, but really across like your 28-day cycle for a woman. And then in the next phase, just like after your period, in that like late follicular phase, estrogen like comes back up and progesterone remains low. And this week is when people typically feel their best. Your mood is better, your energy's higher, your appetite's probably less. And that's because of the estrogen as well. Estrogen's like literally wonder drug. Like my friend Adrienne calls that week like her power week, because she feels like stronger and like better, and typically
apparently you're more attractive too.
You're more so you get like your skin as well changes.
Oh, interesting.
So we call that like the ovulation glow. And it's like just the right balance of estrogen's very like anti-aging, it makes skin look a lot more plump and firmer, and progesterone causes more like sebaceous like oil and like oily skin. So later in the cycle you'll find you get like oily skin, spots and that kind of thing. So we love estrogen.
Such a shame I can't go on the combined pill. I remember one of my friends when she first went on one of the combined pills when we were like 14, she just came on in one day and she was like, guys, look at my boobs. And she was like my boobs have gotten so big and my skin has gotten so clear, and we were all like, what's the pill? Like someone tell us the pill. Yeah,
that particular pill is very good for acne. And then into your luteal phase, so after ovulation, around that time when progesterone's high, your temperature is going to be higher, you're going to retain more water. And like I said earlier, you're burning more calories at rest, you break down more protein, and you'll have higher hunger and cravings. So like make sure, and typically people experience constipation. So you're getting in, what you want to get in is like lots of high fiber foods. Lots of high fiber foods, higher protein, healthy fats are still really important, and like omega-3 fatty acids to help reduce that inflammation before your next period. And
would you generally say to eat more during that time?
Yeah, I would say be intuitive about it, like because it will vary from person to person, like how much calories we're using. But what I try to like really hammer home with a lot of women is that like don't feel like because you've got cravings you need to avoid them and just drink coffee and have gum because you're like afraid of it. Like listen to your body. If it needs more energy, it needs more energy.
Yeah.
And just focus on like getting in as much of the good stuff as you can. And like also we're like less hydrated, so making sure you're just like drinking more water. And then later in that phase, like a lot of women will experience PMS. So 90% of women experience at least some form of premenstrual symptom. And then premenstrual syndrome then is like a smaller subset of women. So that means like it's clinically significant in that it's causing like an effect on your day-to-day life. So it's really impacting you. And then an even smaller subset of women experience PMDD, which is like PMS, but a lot more like mental disturbance. So mental health issues. And that's really tied to your cycle. So if you're someone who experiences PMS, there are certain nutrients that like could be helpful: magnesium supplementation and calcium and vitamin D. They would be like the top ones. And omega-3 is really important as well. We know that like magnesium can help with like period bloat and can help with migraine as well if you get it around your period. And then calcium and vitamin D typically are lower in women with PMS.
Okay.
And when we supplement it in trials, it seems to improve symptoms. So again, like we're talking about like very little research in the space, but more and more is coming out. And I think like hopefully in the future we'll be able to be a little bit more detailed in like what to eat for your cycle. But right now it's really more intuitive. And I'm a huge advocate of like tracking your cycle, tracking your cravings, like really learn what your body needs at those different phases.
What types of tools would you recommend for people to track their cycle? I use Clue, I think it is.
Yeah, I use Clue as well. I mean, you can be as like basic as pen and paper, or like just write it in your notes, like when your period's coming, when it ends, when you think you're ovulating, and any other symptoms across the month. But now that we've got apps that are so accessible and easy to use, like I think Flow, Clue, there's one called like Fitter Woman, which is more catered towards like kind of female athletes or very active women.
Okay, yeah.
But there's so many, and I think like just start tracking it for at least 3 months, and that will give you a good snapshot of like kind of what's happening and things. And it helps inform conversations with healthcare providers.
I remember I used to think that my period was irregular, but I think what happened was that it actually just wasn't a textbook 28-day cycle. And so in my head, I was like, nothing's going to be able to predict it because it's crazy.
Yeah.
And then I remember putting it in, and I've like tracked my period for years now. One thing that's really so anecdotal and so strange and actually like just not useful to the conversation, but my body seems to work on a 12-month cycle, just like the world. Yeah. Just like the world goes around the sun. Because in August, I have my period for 3 weeks every time.
Really?
Yeah.
A 3-week period.
A 3-week period.
I don't feel like that's normal, Grace. That is something that you should get checked out.
I'm well aware I have like, as in like PCOS and stuff, but like as in, yeah, no, there's some strange things going on, but I thought that was quite a fun fact for everyone.
I think like that's an important point, in that like your period will change across your like years, and like what my experience of my menstrual cycle is when I was a teenager is completely different to now.
Right. Yeah.
And it evolves all the time. So I think, and it will change with like your lifestyle and like how stressed you are. Like working in the pandemic, I just lost my period, and then it just came back.
That's so interesting. And I often think, like, I want to talk about stress a little bit and kind of women and stress-related conditions. But on that kind of front, I always think that, like, when talking about women and stress in particular, it's like often in a patronizing sense. Like, it's often been like, oh, you're a little bit stressed. Like, as you said, in terms of like diagnosing anxiety when someone has a heart condition, et cetera, et cetera. Like, the idea of us seeing stress as something that is to do with our like mental resilience rather than also like a literal hormonal like impact. Like if the effect that stress can actually have on your body is obviously like insane. Or like I had a physiologist on the podcast, and he was kind of saying how your body can't really differentiate between like literally going to war and having like, going through a divorce or like whatever it might be, which I'm not saying that, like they're obviously very different like life moments, but in terms of like actually the effect on your body in terms of kind of like hormones and, as you say, like losing your period and all of that, is just like the fact that we think of it as something that we just need to kind of like push through and get more resilient at, rather than actual like lifestyle changes to, I mean, I'm number one culprit for that. I'm like, any medical consultation I have, and they're like, so how stressful is your life? And I'm like, I'm in a very high stress job. And they're like, is there any bandwidth to change that? And I'm like, nope.
Yeah.
Like, I'm afraid not. Well, I'll see you in a few years.
That's the thing. It's like probably the most difficult thing for people to manage. But when it comes to stress and like our menstrual cycle, because like all of our hormonal axes in the body don't just like work in isolation. They like work from like a master regulator in your brain that like feed down to like tell your ovaries produce these hormones. Stress also comes and works in that feedback loop. So like cortisol will down regulate those hormones, which is why if you're really stressed, especially over a long period of time, it will just tell your hormones, your ovaries, to just stop producing hormones. And so typically people will skip a period or miss it for a few weeks if they've gone through like trauma like grief or the pandemic. And the longer that goes on for, the longer it can disrupt it. Like, we're all very different, but what I say is like your menstrual cycle should be a vital sign. Like it tells you how healthy your body is. And so if it just disappears, don't just ignore it. Like, that's reason to go speak to a doctor.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And why are women more likely to experience stress-related conditions?
Yeah, I found this chapter really interesting to write for the book because it goes back to what we said in the beginning, and that like, especially when it comes to mental health, it's not just our biology, so male, female, it's also our gender and our social norms and how society views us as like man and woman. Mm-hmm. And so to like tease that apart's really difficult. So the stats are that like women are twice as likely to experience anxiety and depression in their lifetime, be diagnosed with it. And that's true of all the anxiety disorders, even like phobias and things like that. The reason why that is, we're not entirely sure. It seems to be both biology and kind of social and gender kind of norms in how we deal with stress. Mm-hmm. So on a kind of biological level, there seems to be something to do with hormones and how we respond differently in terms of that like fight or flight response. Okay. So men typically will fight in a kind of stressful scenario, whereas women, they use this term in the research called tend and befriend, where they'll look after or they'll look out for their offspring or the people closest to them first, and then they'll deal with themselves. And we are more dependent on other people for our mental health and our mental well-being than men are. Men are more independent in terms of their emotion. But also like we have kind of gender norms of like men should be stoic and like kind of keep their feelings in, whereas like women are hysterical and they cry all the time and they're emotional, and it's down to our hormones. And that's the thing that can get really sinister, because for both men and women, because then men, you know, don't deal with their feelings and then they'll externalize it and go to drinking or gambling or suicide, whereas women will ruminate and they will experience depression, anxiety and other phobias. And like I said earlier in the episode, women are more likely to be given a psychiatric diagnosis for a physical problem. Mm-hmm. Even in research where both male and female patients will present with the same symptoms, with the same condition, and yet doctors will be more likely to give the man kind of more formal investigations like x-rays, and they're more likely to give women lifestyle advice and send them home with anti-anxiety medication.
That's helpful, thank you. I will go to the gym rather than getting this MRI scan, thank you. That is crazy.
It's crazy. And women are, even when we account for rates of anxiety, women are more likely to be on antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. So there's like this huge discrepancy in who we're prescribing to.
It also kind of feels like the fact that, and this might be a bit of a reach, but like the fact that when I've kind of, you know, might be like a PCOS consultation, whatever it might be, and they're kind of talking about stress and the effect of it. And I completely understand, like, I should probably live a less stressful life. But I also feel like I am quite good at dealing with stress in terms of the way that I kind of perform. And it's always, you know, I feel more comfortable in a little bit of chaos and kind of all of that. And the fact that I do sometimes question whether it's seen as less necessary for a woman to live a stressful life. So it's kind of like when asking someone like, oh, are you in a stressful job? And almost being able to assume that they might be able to change their lifestyle to stop that stressful job. Yeah. Like, I'm not sure you'd listen to a man being like, and then when they're like, oh, what makes your job so stressful? And kind of being like, oh, well, you know, I have a VC-backed startup and it's, you know, it's quite a lot of work and it's pretty chaotic and it changes all the time and all of this. I'm not sure you'd ever assume that a man would kind of have an option to like chill that out a bit. It's kind of like our ingrained kind of, well, women are the caregivers and men are working. Like even the suggestion of being like, oh, could you just like chill that out a bit seems like it's almost like a little bit of playtime because it's a woman's job rather than being that.
Yeah. It's that's it. And it's, I think like all these things like contribute to that narrative we have around women. And like, I'm not completely dismissing the fact that women do experience anxiety, and I don't want to,
yeah, of course,
anyone to think that like I myself have a diagnosis of anxiety, but I think it shouldn't be the diagnosis of default. It should be the diagnosis of exclusion.
Yeah, things can still exist and not be, that's it, you know, the default.
Of course. And I think when it comes to kind of female biology, we also see like this massive divergence in depression diagnoses after puberty between females and males. So there's definitely like some kind of hormonal workings going on there. But the other thing that like I think is really important to think about is at puberty as well, it's not just these like new hormones that you're experiencing, but you're also probably at a new school. You've probably just discovered boys. You've just like discovered Mean Girls. So there's like lots of things that could be contributing to your mood.
Yeah.
So yes, hormones are at play, but we should all also like think about what else is going on in someone else's life.
Yeah. So I want to talk about sleep, having spoken about stress, and as someone who was up from 3:30 thinking about something. I want to just talk a little bit about sleep and its kind of overall effect on your health. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually seen a TikTok recently of another doctor who's like a CrossFit doctor, and she was like, sleep is the #1 performance drug. And I was like, that's so true. Because it is. It's like when we release most of our like growth hormones and anabolic hormones, and when we do all our recovery, and like when our body basically just presses a reset, but it's not like a passive process. So much happens when we're asleep. So it's not something you can like kind of skip out on. Like we can tie it to basically every kind of health outcome, whether it's like cardiovascular disease, whether it's stress related diseases or anxiety disorders, whether it's like gut health issues. Like stress is so incredibly important for everything, but also like, you know, it helps us perform better. It helps us like maintain attention and focus, like contribute to our relationships, be less irritable. So it's one of the most kind of the biggest low hanging fruit that we can have for our health. Like even one night of poor sleep, and I know you don't want to hear this right now, can like impair your immune system and make you more susceptible to catching a cold.
I mean, I am sleep's biggest fan. I think that like there is this assumption that like, especially in the type of work I do, there's this whole like, obviously there's all the 5 a.m. club stuff, but there's also the kind of like sleep when you're dead.
Yeah.
Like you can just like sleep 4 hours and then you get like X amount more hours work. And it's like, I will be the first person to say that, first of all, I must get 8 hours every night. Like I am weak. It is what I need. I can't make decisions on it otherwise. I mean, obviously I can make decisions, but like I am a completely different person, and that is my threshold. And I know some people are happy on less, some people are happy on more. To me, it actually hugely changes like everything. And like I can so believe like all of the science around sleep. I'm like, yes, I see it. It changes me completely. It changes my like how I get ill. It changes like absolutely everything. But even like my overthinking reflex is like completely different when I haven't had sleep. So like last night, for example, when I was up from like 3 or whatever it was, I was thinking about this, and actually the night before as well, I was thinking about this thing, and I know I can't trust myself. Like I can't trust myself at that time in the night when I've had that much sleep, because I'll think about it and I catastrophize to such an extent. And it's like I'm possessed, because I'm like in that moment, I'm like, I know this isn't actually what I'm thinking. And it's almost like I'll explode if I don't do something about it. But I'm also like, you're not thinking about this. Like, as in like, you're not thinking about this in like a rational sense, and your responses and your like catastrophizing of it is like not normal. And then I think that like, it took me so long to realize like actually how important it was. And actually how, when you think about like getting enough hours sleep a night versus like, okay, it might be working in those hours instead. Like when people are like, get, 4 hours sleep and like work until 11 or whatever it might be, I realized that for me personally, that was actually like less good self-control, because it's you trusting the process less and having to spend more time working that's not actually like productive, because you're thinking like, oh, it's all about hours rather than about actual like substance and what you can bring to those hours. But like, I am the biggest believer in like, I mean, I'm a whole different person when I haven't slept properly, and I just know it's not something I can compromise. Like, it's just, I will do anything to make sure I get my sleep, and otherwise I will not be making decisions.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think like as I've gotten older, I've definitely appreciated it more. And now that I know what I know, I'm like, why did I pull all-nighters when I was like probably sabotaging my chances of doing well in these exams? Yeah. When like the most like, that's when we consolidate our memories.
Your brain actually wasn't going to work. Yeah, exactly. Like your brain actually wasn't going to work well the next day when you were revising through the night. Obviously, there's a limit. Like when you I actually don't know anything about something, then it's probably best to, be doing some revising. But no, I completely agree. I think that's one of the biggest things. Again, just fun facts from Grace. That's one of the biggest things that terrifies me about having children. It's just not being able to control your sleep. Like, I think about it a lot. Like, I think that will change the entire timeline of like when I like hopefully think about having children. Is like the fact that like I just know I won't be able to perform anywhere near as much because I'm so weak when it comes to like my like sleep disturbance and like how it affects my day.
That's it. You're just gonna have to accept it.
I'm not sure. Maybe I just never will. But no, I think that is all like incredibly important, and I think that we often, it feels again like this kind of like weak thing that we need to be doing, and just like it's our like body's downfall that it needs to kind of have this sleep, whereas actually it's like, oh no, it's like it can be like your superpower, like actually getting that much in.
It's why we're such an advanced species, because we have to recover. And like your experience of like kind of being awake and ruminating in the middle of the night is like very universal for women. Like it's women will typically get more hours in bed but less good quality sleep, because we do have more awakenings in the night. And like I know I'm the exact same as you, and my boyfriend's like how does this happen to you so regularly? Like you've had no caffeine, you've like gone to bed at a good time. I'm like, it just happens.
It's just a thing. No, I completely get that. And what steps can people take in order to be able, first of all, actually, and I know it'll be unique to individuals, but like what thresholds can people be like aiming for in terms of like what they, general rules around sleep?
I mean, the like magic number is really like 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And I think anything below 6, definitely anything below 5 is when you start to see like poor health outcomes, especially if it's like consistent. Like I don't mean that like, you have a night out and you get 5 hours sleep, fair enough. But if you're doing it like quite regularly, 5 to 6 hours, like, and if there's nothing else you change in your life, that would be the one thing I'd like say, can you increase that? Like, can you get into bed half an hour early? If you can't, can you nap in the day? Like, just try to make up as much sleep as you can. Like some people argue that you can't make up your sleep debt, but I think like if that's your only option, that's what I do.
Still better than nothing.
Because it can be quite refreshing. But other than that, like I think sleep hygiene, like sleep's gotten quite big recently, maybe with the Matthew Walker book. But what I'd say is like a good night's sleep starts first thing in the morning. And so what you should be doing is viewing early morning light at least 30 minutes on waking, which is really hard because not many of us will like wake up and be at the door in 30 minutes.
And also the UK doesn't sponsor light. Like it's just like, afraid not.
Until now, like it's only starting to get light in the mornings. But what I do in the winter months is like I will sit in front of my sad lamp, which when I'm like writing my to-do list and just like getting ready. So 30 minutes of that can like replicate kind of 10 minutes outside. And that the benefits of that is that it basically shifts your circadian rhythm and makes you feel sleepy earlier. It helps you have a more restful sleep. Then like across the day, thinking about like what you're doing, like definitely try to move your body at some point, which can help with sleep. I would cut off like caffeine consumption at midday at least.
I do that and people think I'm crazy. But I remember just hearing, I think it was on the Matthew Walker, in the Matthew Walker book, or he talked about it on a podcast. But it was like the half-life of caffeine.
Yeah, it can be up to 10 hours in some people.
Right.
So like if you have your last coffee at 12, you could still be metabolizing it at 10 p.m.
Right, which is not what you want to be doing.
Not what you want. But also thinking about like your last meal time and try to have that like 3 hours before bed, which is tricky.
Yeah, so I have a new heart rate monitor and it always tells me when it knows when I've had a late meal. It's like, oh, you had a late meal last night and therefore your heart rate was higher like throughout the night and didn't settle until like 6 a.m, which means that you're feeling like less restful today. And I'm like, you're so smart. Like, you know me so well, honey.
Well, that's
but it's so true. And I didn't realize, because I think I operate on such a routine, and that routine is based entirely around like my work performance, that it's kind of, and also like wanting to fit social life in there, that it's like, this is the only option. So it's like, this is how we're going to do it. But actually looking at that and being like, could I maybe even, like, if I'm going to stay late at work, could I, and I know this is really bad, but like, could I maybe have my dinner at work before I go home and then just relax when I go home, rather than being like, well, I want to be in front of the TV relaxing, having dinner, so I'm going to like shift that later. But like I have like a much worse score on like my readiness and everything when I've like had a later meal, which I think is, I mean, it's like I didn't trust the science.
Well, that's it. You know, your body has to, if it's like focusing on digesting food, it's diverting its energy away from like important restorative processes. So yeah, I would say like try to have your last meal 3 hours before bed, but it's not always possible, especially like when you're socializing.
3 hours, yeah, there is no way. I'm afraid, but thank you. Thanks for your advice.
And then the other thing like that people often use to help them fall asleep is alcohol. And it can help you fall asleep quicker, but it will mean that like the quality of your sleep is
just for
terrible.
clarifying, I just said yes, like I have like a like shot of vodka before bed, and like I just like to clarify that that's what I was like. Yes. My like hot toddy,
my nightcap.
Me just sitting there with my bottle by the bed. Which is not the case. But I do agree, like when I have a glass of red wine, I'm like, oh, perfect.
Yeah,
sleepy.
because it makes you feel sleepy. And for some people, like, maybe one drink won't affect you, but the research suggests otherwise. I know for me that like if it's anything over one glass of wine, like even just like one and a smidge, like my sleep will be completely disrupted. And like I also track my sleep and my recovery will be like red line. And I'm like, it just, the impact alcohol has on your body. And like, I'm not like an anti-alcohol person, but I do think once you start to really realize the effects on your body, you're like, this cannot be good for me.
Yeah. God, it's just no fun.
It's no fun. It's
really
no fun.
rude.
And then like last kind of thing before night, I think everyone knows this, like not to be looking at blue light emitting devices and like turning down overlight lights.
Overlight, turning off your headlights. Don't have your car in your bedroom.
Don't have your car in your bedroom. Turn off overhead lights. And like
don't use
lamps,
the big light.
or like your candles instead. And like have your room dim, dark and quiet.
Yeah.
Like,
and I believe so strongly in sleep hygiene in terms of like the subliminal messages you give your body in order for it to know like that you're going to sleep. Like there's this one, I think it's called like Deep Sleep on Spotify. It's just like this playlist that I turn on. It's like if I'm there's two playlists. There's like essentially, but it's like my body knows that in that moment, and it's just like these like kind of stimulating it from these different areas and just being like, I don't know, it's like I suddenly feel like I'm in like this cocoon and I'm like, okay, it's sleep time. And it really, really does work. And it's just like these cues. Sure. It's just like these cues that actually kind of, whether you know it or not, or whether you find it stupid or not, like having that kind of routine that makes your body think, oh no, I know what time it is now.
Yeah, that's so important, like a sleep routine. One of my friends, Michael, says like the sun doesn't just like set, like it slowly sets. So like don't expect yourself to just like get into bed and be like,
yeah, exactly.
It takes time. So like regardless of what your routine is, if it's like spraying lavender spray on your pillow or your favorite pajamas or having a bath, like, or having a herbal tea, regardless of what it is, if that's what you do every night, it will send a signal to your head. It's like why reading kids books before bed works, because they're like, oh, it's bedtime. I know this. Like this is familiar. It's time to go to sleep.
Yeah. No, I see that. It's like when your dog knows like what time of the day it is. Like when your dog knows it's like walk time. Or like when your dog, like as in it's specific, like as in it's based on your movements that you probably don't even know you do, but it like gives you that cue. So you're welcome. I could work in science. Me just like, yeah, sure, helpful.
You're all dogs.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Your little pooches going for a poo. But no, this has all been incredibly interesting. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm sorry if anyone heard a drilling in the background. There appears to be some recreational building work going on in this building today. But honestly, this has been such an interesting podcast, so actionable. I will be prescribing myself more sleep tonight, although I will be having alcohol, so it'll probably all cancel each other out. But no, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
You've been great, and I've learned so much, and I'm sure people will find it incredibly helpful.
I hope so. Thank you for having me.